Hello and welcome to the Behind the Stripes football webcast. This is Tribune sports editor Joe Waljasper along with Tribune football beat writer Dave Matter. Dave, 2 scrimmages now in the books, and one thing we've noticed, I think, sitting in the stands watching is that maybe if you didn't know what order the quarterbacks were on the depth chart, you would probably be most impressed with what we've seen from Ashton Glaser, at least amongst the reserves.
Right.
He moved up 1 spot in the last depth chart to number 3. Is there any chance you see of him becoming the backup?
I really don't think so, because just listening to Gary Pinkel last week, he got didn't really want to comment too much on the depth chart there, not as much as he has in weeks past or at other positions. That is the one position where they tend to be a little more sensitive with their comments, because that position is so crucial. And he said that there's a battle for the number 3 job. He didn't go out of his way to say there's a battle for the number 2 job. Now, he said that James Franklin could lose the job at number 2, but he'd have to be beaten out, which leads me to believe that they're pretty sold on him at this point as the backup. Not quite sure yet if they've decided he's going to play, but I think they're probably leaning that way, unless he just really takes a backward step here in the last week, and I don't see that happening. But I do think Glaser is in the running for that number 3 job, and you ask what the difference is between 2 and 3. Well, the big difference is between 3 and 4, because he'll be working with the Missouri's offense all week in practice rather than running the scout team. And he has looked pretty good, I think we can all agree, during these scrimmages. And, he just come along a lot further than he was, in the spring, especially since last year.
Now, is there any chance that Franklin would be number 2, but if they just wanted to use somebody in garbage time, they would play the number 3 guy and save his red shirt unless they had to burn it, or do they just not think that way?
I don't know. I don't think they really go at it that way. I think they're a little more calculated in who's going to play, and they'll be thinking about long-term things down the road, even though they'll never admit that. And they would want probably the best long-term option to be the guy that gets that game experience. And I think at this point, it's safe to say it's probably James Franklin, although Glaser has played well in these scrimmages.
Another thing that's caught our eye at these scrimmages is more of a negative. It's Grant Ressel, who was as close to perfect as you can be last year, has been quite the opposite in the practices, and it almost seems like Trey Barrow has outkicked him in scrimmages especially. Do you think that job is open, or is he got to prove he isn't the number 1 guy in games when you think about what he did last year?
I think yes and yes. I think Gary Pinkel has said that it's open. Barrow's getting a good look, but I do think when it comes down to it, I think Ressel earns the benefit of the doubt until he screws up in a game. And to his credit, he didn't kick that well last August. It didn't going into that Illinois game. I don't think any of us that watched practice were convinced he was going to be this automatic machine at kicking field goals and extra points, and he was. Typically, Gary Pinkel doesn't like players who are the gamers, who don't practice so well, but do well in games, and maybe he was a case of that last year. But something's going on right now. I got to think it's a little more mental. Maybe just his footwork is off, but he just doesn't look like the same guy out there in some of these scrimmages. So be interesting to see what happens. But I'd be really surprised if he's not kicking field goals against Illinois. He was an All-American last year, so I think they'll give him the benefit of the doubt.
It'd be crazy not to. I mean, there might not even be a problem. I mean, you don't want to pull the guy. I mean, He was really the thing going into the year that was the most nailed down, don't worry about it position on the team. So I would be shocked if he wasn't the kicker. From what we've seen so far, do you believe this year's defense is ahead of last year? I think that was something that they returned a lot of guys, maybe not the star power, obviously, with Sean Witherspoon, but do you think this defense is better than what we saw last year?
I'm not convinced yet. Outside of the bowl game last year, Missouri was really good against the run. They were physical up front. Linebackers very good with Witherspoon and Will Ebner. This year, not that I don't think they can be better eventually, but just going into the year, I'm not sure they can be as good. And they weren't even that good last year. I think in times they were, in stretches they were. I think at cornerback, I think Carl Geddes might be having the best camp of any defensive player not named Alden Smith. And certainly having Smith back, a year older, more experienced, is really going to help them at defensive end. Still not convinced that the defensive tackles are a huge upgrade from what they've had in years past. I think those guys still have a lot to prove. I think at safety, I think they're more physical back there. I think Kenja Jackson is playing better than he was going into last season. And then the linebackers, that they're never going to replace Witherspoon, and now they're looking at a situation where they might not have Ebner for a while, and they haven't had him all camp because he's been out with a hamstring injury, and now he has the legal issue. We'll find out if he's facing a suspension or not. So I'm just not quite sold yet. This defense will be much better. But then again, if you look at everything they did last year, I think there's a lot of room for improvement anyway. So I don't know how great it has to be better than last year's defense.
Yeah, I think last year it seemed like they were pretty good against the run, especially against traditional teams. But this year I really question their defensive tackle situation. I mean, the starting defensive tackles certainly haven't wowed me, but then behind them, it's guys you've never heard much about. And you kind of wonder if teams are going to be able to just put it on the ground and run it up the middle on them.
So far, Missouri's been able
Right.
to run it on them, and Missouri's not really a physical, overpowering running team, but they've been able to do it in scrimmages and practices.
And the other thing is the safety position. You don't see a lot of those guys. They're just guys back there, it seems like, at this point.
Yeah, so we'll see if they can turn it on, but like you said, it's not a real dynamic group, I don't think.
All right, lastly, Dave's viewer mail.
We have
solicited through Twitter.
We have a question from reader Brad Filbert, and he wants to know, besides Blaine Gabbert, who can Mizzou least afford to lose to injury this year?
I think we got this question last year, too.
Yeah, and I think the answers might be a little similar. I think you look on the offensive line, Tim Barnes is the centerpiece to everything they do as the center, the most experienced guy up front. I don't think you want to lose him. I think you've got better depth at the other positions. But then I think you got to look at the receiver position because you're going to be without Jarrell Jackson at the beginning of the year anyway with that wrist injury. TJ Moe, it's crazy to say about a guy who only has 2 career catches, but right now it looks like their most effective receiver. I think you'd be in real trouble if he goes down, and maybe the same for Michael Agnew, who plays that tight end position. He's, I think, going to be one of the real featured receivers this year. And then obviously Alden Smith. I mean, everything that he did last year, he's I think, going to be better this year. His numbers might not be as good because teams are going to focus on him more, but I don't think you can afford to lose your by far best defensive player, and he is that for Missouri.
Yeah, he's the guy, I would say.
Yeah.
All right, well, this next week will be our final preseason webcast where we will preview the Illinois game.